The story of American air power in World War II begins not with triumph, but with challenge. In January of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces activated the 8th Air Force at Savannah, Georgia. This new force was born into a world at war, yet it started with almost nothing. No men, no equipment, no combat experience. General IREC Eaker took command of what would become known as the Mighty Eighth. But in those early days, his command was hardly mighty at all. He was promised 100 aircraft, but those planes were often diverted to other theaters of war. The 8th Air Force sat in America, waiting, training, preparing for the moment when it would finally see combat. That moment came when the first contingent of American flyers and their machines were shipped across the Atlantic to England. They arrived not knowing what horrors awaited them, not understanding the deadly nature of aerial combat over enemy territory. Yet they came anyway, ready to learn, ready to fight, ready to take the war to Nazi Germany from the skies above Europe. These brave airmen represented America's answer to German air power, and they carried with them the hope of a free world that desperately needed their sacrifice and skill. On the 4th of July, 1942, American pilots flew their first combat mission from England. These men flew borrowed Royal Air Force Boston Light bombers toward the occupied Netherlands, targeting German Luftwaffe airfields. 6 American crews from the 15th Bombardment Squadron and 6 RAF crews attacked their objective. But the cost was heavy even in this first mission. 2 American crews were lost in that single day. The losses seemed enormous for what had been accomplished, but this first mission set the tone for what was to come. It showed the world that American airmen were willing to fight, willing to die, and willing to learn from their mistakes. The commanders studied what went wrong, analyzed the tactics, and prepared for the missions ahead. Not every bomb found its target. Not every formation came home intact. The men of the 8th learned early that air warfare over enemy territory was not like training flights back home. The German defenders were skilled, determined, and willing to fight to the death to protect their homeland. Each mission brought new lessons, new dangers, new demands on the courage of young men barely out of their teens. These pioneers of American air power in Europe were writing the book on strategic bombing as they flew, learning from the blood and sacrifice of their brothers in the air. The early years of the 8th Air Force were marked by terrible losses and mounting frustration. The bombers being used, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were powerful machines, but they could not defend themselves adequately against German fighters. When bombers flew into Germany without escort fighters, the Luftwaffe made them pay dearly. The famous Schweinfurt missions of 1943 represent the very worst of this period. In each of those missions, 1 out of every 4 bombers was shot down. The losses in men were staggering, with over 600 killed or captured on each single day of operations. Men who trained for months suddenly found themselves falling from the sky or watching their friends burn in the wreckage of their aircraft. Yet despite these terrible losses, the 8th Air Force never turned back. Not once did crews refuse to fly. Not once did the formations break and run for safety. They pressed on toward their targets, accepting death as the price of duty. The brave men who flew those early missions knew the odds were against them. They knew many would not return. Still they climbed into their aircraft and flew into the German air defense. This was the true test of courage, not the easy missions of later years, but these early operations where death was almost certain and victory seemed far away. Everything changed when long-range fighter planes finally arrived to escort the bombers. The P-51 Mustang was a game-changer, a fighter that could fly deep into Germany and return home safely. With the arrival of the Mustang and improvements to the P-47 Thunderbolt, the 8th Air Force gained the ability to protect its bomber formations at all ranges of the air war. Now German fighters could not savage the bombers without facing opposition. American fighter pilots like Colonel Francis Gabreski flew their Mustangs with skill, and determination, becoming aces with many confirmed victories. Gabreski would ultimately score 28 victories in Europe, earning the title of leading American ace in the European theater. With fighter escort in place, the 8th Air Force began to change the nature of the air war. The bombers now had protection, and that protection made all the difference. German pilots found themselves facing deadly American fighters that were equal to anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. The fighter pilots of the 8th took the fight to the enemy, attacking not just bombers, but also German fighters and targets on the ground. They became masters of air combat, learning new tactics and techniques that would influence air warfare for generations to come. By 1944, the 8th Air Force had grown into a truly mighty force. At its peak, the 8th could launch over 2,000 heavy bombers and more than 1,000 fighters on a single mission. Never in the history of warfare had there been an air armada of such enormous size and power. The logistics alone were staggering. Thousands of tons of fuel, bombs, ammunition, and supplies had to move constantly to support these operations. Ground crews worked around the clock, maintaining the aircraft, loading bombs, and preparing for the next day's mission. The airfields across England were filled with aircraft, stretching from one end to the other, packed so closely together that a spark could have set off a disaster. The organization required to manage all of this was like a city unto itself, with supply lines running across the Atlantic and armies of support personnel keeping the machines flying. The command structure grew enormously, with 3 bomber divisions and 2 fighter divisions operating under the overall command of the 8th Air Force headquarters. What had started as a small force with almost no equipment had become the largest air force the world had ever seen. American industrial power, American determination, and American courage had built something truly remarkable in the skies over Europe. The operation known as Big Week came in February of 1944 and represented the concentrated fury of the 8th Air Force. Over the course of 6 days, the 8th flew approximately 3,300 bomber sorties and 2,548 fighter sorties. The bombers dropped over 10,000 tons of explosives on German aircraft factories scattered across the Reich. The sky above Germany was filled with smoke and fire as formation after formation of bombers reached their targets and dropped their loads. Fighter planes twisted and turned in dogfights as American pilots fought German fighters for control of the air. The physical damage to the German aircraft industry was enormous, with many factories badly damaged or completely destroyed. But the real victory of Big Week was the destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. The Germans lost approximately 450 aircraft and many experienced pilots who could never be replaced. German pilot training never fully recovered from these losses. The German Air Force would continue to defend the homeland, but it was never again strong enough to stop the American bombers. Big Week proved that the 8th Air Force had become a decisive weapon in the war against Nazi Germany. It showed that American airmen, with their courage and determination, could overcome any opponent and achieve any objective they were given. In preparation for the invasion of Normandy, the 8th Air Force shifted its focus from industrial targets to transportation networks in France and Belgium. This operation, called the Transportation Plan, was designed to isolate the beaches where American and British forces would land. The bombers attacked railroads, bridges, roads, and supply depots. The goal was simple but deadly in its implications: cut off German ability to reinforce the invasion beaches with troops and supplies. The campaign was controversial because civilian lives would inevitably be lost in the bombing of French and Belgian towns. Some commanders questioned whether the cost was worth it, but the results proved that the plan was sound. When American soldiers waded ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, German forces could not reinforce their defensive positions adequately. Troops that should have arrived in hours took days. Supply lines that should have been flowing freely were cut and disrupted. The 8th Air Force had prepared the battlefield for the greatest invasion in history. Without air superiority, without the isolation of the beaches achieved by Bomber Command, the invasion would have been far more difficult, far more costly, and might even have failed. The sacrifice of civilian lives, though tragic, had been part of a larger strategy that would ultimately liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. The courage of the bomber crews cannot be overstated when discussing the achievements of the 8th Air Force. These men, many barely 20 years old, climbed into their aircraft knowing that they might not return. Flying a bomber mission over Germany was one of the deadliest assignments in all of World War II. The men in the bomber crew had specific tasks. The pilot flew the aircraft. The co-pilot assisted and was ready to take over if needed. The bombardier aimed and released the bombs. The navigator plotted the course through the darkness. The radio operator communicated with other aircraft, and with ground control, the engineer monitored the engines. The waist gunners manned machine guns on the sides of the fuselage. The tail gunner defended against attacks from behind. The ball turret gunner tucked himself into a small sphere underneath the bomber and protected from below. Each man depended on every other man. A failure by one could mean death for all 10 members of the crew. They trained together, flew together, and many died together in the cold skies of Europe. Letters home spoke of loneliness, fear, and determination. Diaries recorded the daily reality of seeing friends killed, carrying on despite the losses, and flying mission after mission. One bomber crew became famous not because they were better than others, but because their story was preserved for history. The Memphis Belle, a B-17 Flying Fortress, became the first bomber to complete 25 missions. 25 missions was the goal that airmen flew toward, the number of successful runs that would allow them to go home and leave the war behind. The Memphis Belle and her crew, led by Captain Robert Morgan, became symbols of American determination and grit. When they completed their 25th mission, they were allowed to leave for home. The crew returned to America to tell their story, to speak at war bond rallies, and to inspire the American people. Their story was later made into a famous documentary film, and then a Hollywood movie. But the Memphis Belle was not the only bomber crew to reach 25 missions. Many others did the same, though their stories were not preserved for the movies. Others never made it to 25. Some crews were shot down on their second mission. Some survived the first tour and volunteered to fly additional missions. One man, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosenthal of the 100th Bombardment Group, flew an extraordinary 52 combat missions, far exceeding the normal tour requirement. Rosenthal's survival and continued effectiveness made him a symbol of American determination and the will to never give up. The leadership of the 8th Air Force recognized early that standard tactics were not working and had to be changed. Colonel Curtis LeMay emerged as one of the most effective commanders in the entire air war. LeMay studied the losses and understood that the way to reduce casualties was through better training and better tactics. He made innovations in formation flying that improved the defensive power of bomber formations. He changed the approach tactics that bombers used when attacking targets. He revolutionized crew training, demanding that standards be met and that discipline be maintained. LeMay's most famous tactic was his insistence that bombers maintain their course during the bomb run, regardless of flak and fighter attacks. This sounds simple, but it was incredibly difficult to maintain course when shells were exploding all around and fighters were attacking from all angles. Yet maintaining course improved bombing accuracy dramatically. When you could see the target and release your bombs accurately, you did not have to fly as many missions to achieve your objectives. Fewer missions meant fewer casualties. LeMay understood that the way to win wars was through efficiency and discipline, not through heroism and individual acts of courage. His methods became standard throughout the 8th Air Force. The German response to American bombing was fierce and determined, but it was ultimately insufficient to stop the 8th Air Force. The Luftwaffe committed its finest fighters and most experienced pilots to the defense of the homeland. German pilots like Adolf Galland and Erich Hartmann flew their fighters with incredible skill and determination. They shot down many American bombers and fighters. But the Germans could not replace their losses as quickly as America could replace hers. When a German pilot was shot down and captured, Germany lost that pilot forever. When an American pilot was shot down over friendly territory or captured, there was at least a chance he could escape and fight again. American pilot training continued producing more and more skilled aviators, while German pilot training declined as experienced instructors were killed in combat. The Luftwaffe also had to deal with the problem of defending a homeland under attack from two sides. The British attacked at night. The Americans attacked during the day. The Luftwaffe had to be ready at any moment. The strain of constant combat operations wore down German pilots and ground crews alike. By 1945, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former power. In March of 1945, the German Air Force introduced its secret weapon, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was faster than anything the Allies had, faster than the P-51 Mustang, and faster than the P-47 Thunderbolt. But the jet came too late and in too few numbers. The Germans could not produce enough jets to make a difference. Fuel was scarce and had to be rationed. Trained pilots were scarce because so many had been killed. Manufacturing facilities had been bombed. The jet aircraft that should have changed the course of the air war arrived only in time to fire a few shots before Germany surrendered. American fighter pilots learned quickly how to deal with the Me-262 by attacking it when it was taking off or landing when it was at its most vulnerable. Once in the air, the jet was nearly impossible to catch, but American pilots were willing to accept that limitation if they could catch the jets on the ground. The appearance of the Me-262 showed that German technology was still advanced, but technology alone cannot win a war without the industrial capacity to produce it in quantity and the trained personnel to operate it effectively. By the spring of 1945, the 8th Air Force ranged across the collapsing German Reich with almost total air superiority. German fighters could no longer effectively challenge American bombers. The sky belonged to America. 8th Air Force bombers attacked targets as far east as Hungary. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, attacked oil facilities in Yugoslavia, Romania, and northeastern Italy. The two American air forces coordinated their operations to bring maximum pressure on the German war machine. No German aircraft production facility was safe. No oil refinery was secure. No supply line could operate without fear of air attack. German cities burned. German industry ground to a halt. The German army found itself unable to move freely in daylight for fear of air attack. German reserves could not be moved to the front lines because of threats from the air. The power of air superiority had become clear to everyone. The nation that controlled the air could shape events on the ground. The nation without air superiority found itself unable to conduct military operations effectively. America had fought for and won that air superiority through the blood and sacrifice of the men of the 8th Air Force. The human cost of the 8th Air Force campaign was staggering and must never be forgotten. Over 26,000 airmen were killed in action flying for the 8th. Another 28,000 were captured and became prisoners of war. Out of approximately 350,000 Americans who served in the 8th Air Force during the war in Europe, over 54,000 were killed or captured. These numbers represent real people, young men with families back home, with dreams and hopes for the future. Many never came home. Many spent years in German prisoner of war camps. Many who did come home carried the physical and mental wounds of war for the rest of their lives. Every bomber shot down meant 10 men lost. Every fighter shot down meant 1 man lost. The losses added up day after day mission after mission. At the peak strength of the 8th, around the time of the D-Day invasion, there were 25,000 men and women on the rolls. The turnover of personnel was constant. New crews arrived as others were sent home or lost to enemy action. The toll on the morale of the organization must have been enormous, yet the 8th Air Force kept flying, kept fighting, kept sacrificing. The tactics of strategic bombing used by the 8th Air Force were controversial then, and remain controversial today. Military leaders argued about whether bombing civilian areas was justified. Some commanders believed that targeting industrial areas inevitably meant targeting civilian populations nearby. Others argued that careful selection of military and industrial targets could minimize civilian casualties while still achieving military objectives. The reality was somewhere in between. Many of the targets hit by the 8th Air Force were legitimate military and industrial targets. Many of these targets were located in or near civilian populated areas. The bombing campaign did cause significant civilian casualties, particularly when entire cities were firebombed by other air forces. The 8th Air Force argued that its bombing campaign was more precise than that of other air forces, and that it focused on specific targets rather than entire cities. Whether one believes the bombing campaign was justified or not, there is no question that it was effective. German war production was crippled. German morale was damaged. German ability to wage war was severely diminished. The bases of the 8th Air Force stretched across eastern England, particularly around East Anglia. These airfields became miniature cities unto themselves. Thousands of personnel lived on each base. Barracks housed the airmen and soldiers. Repair shops maintained the aircraft. Supply warehouses stored the ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Mess halls fed the thousands of men and women on the base. Recreation facilities provided some relief from the stress of operations. By 1944, the airfields were packed so closely with aircraft that a fire in one area could have spread to dozens of others. The British civilian population living nearby became accustomed to the sound of hundreds of bombers taking off in the morning and the uncertainty of whether they would all return. Many did not return. The local communities grieved the losses of young men who had trained in their towns and become part of their communities. The gratitude and admiration of the British people for the American airmen never wavered, even when bombing missions accidentally hit civilian areas in England. On April 25, 1945, the 8th Air Force attacked its last industrial target of World War II. An armament works in Czechoslovakia was the final blow in a campaign that had lasted almost 3 years. By that time, Germany was on the verge of surrender. The war in Europe would end just 10 days later with the German surrender on May 7th. The 8th had survived the terrible early years with almost no fighter escort and had grown into a force that nobody could stand against. German fighters could no longer challenge the bombers. German air defenses could no longer prevent American attacks. German industry had been destroyed. The mission had been accomplished. The two primary objectives of the 8th Air Force had been achieved. First, the German Luftwaffe had been destroyed. Second, Nazi Germany's ability to wage war had been crippled by the bombing campaign. These achievements had come at a great cost, but the cost had been worth paying to defeat Nazi tyranny and free the people of Europe from dictatorial rule. The legacy of the mighty 8th Air Force endures to this day as a testament to American courage, determination, and sacrifice. The men who flew those missions wrote the book on strategic air operations and modern air warfare. They proved that air power could be decisive in modern warfare, a lesson that influences military strategy even today. The courage of those young airmen, many barely out of their teens, facing death every time they flew, represents the best of the American spirit. They were not all heroes in the romantic sense. Many were scared. Many wanted to go home. Many questioned whether the bombing campaign was right. Yet they flew anyway, because duty demanded it and because their nation needed them. Out of their sacrifice came victory in Europe. Out of their struggle came the birth of air power as we know it today. The mighty 8th Air Force helped America and its allies win World War II and helped ensure that freedom would triumph over tyranny in Europe. Their story must never be forgotten.